I'd like to welcome our first keynote speaker, who is Noah Goodman. He's going to be talking to us about reasoning in human and machine intelligence. Noah is an assistant professor of psychology, linguistics, and computer science at the University of Stanford. He received his PhD in maths from the University of Texas at Austin in 2003 and moved to University of Stanford in 2010, where he runs the Computation and Cognition Lab. Noah studies the computational basis of human thought, merging behavioral experiments with formal methods of statistics and logic. Specific projects vary from concept learning and language to inference algorithms for probabilistic programming languages. So it's a great treat for those of you online. Good morning, good evening, good night. Thank you for joining us again today. For those of you watching afterwards, you're in for a big treat. And for those of us here in the room, please let's welcome Noah for the opening keynote of day 3, AGI-23 in Stockholm.
Great, happy to be here. Thanks for waking up at roughly midnight, at least for me. Oh, I come to the Nordic countries and I get a ritual harpoon for my talk. It's excellent. There will be large fish to spear. So when I started thinking about cognition, maybe 20 years ago, we were in this kind of situation where we thought that there was a large space of possible intelligent agents, but effectively, the only example we had was human cognition. This isn't quite true. Of course, there were animals, but I was interested in language and reasoning and these kind of high-level cognition topics. And so for those things, really, all we could do was think about the properties of human cognition and hope that they would generalize to tell us about the sort of space of intelligences more broadly. Now, I think we're in a kind of unusual and exciting position all of a sudden in the last few years, because there are these weird alien intelligences popping up, in particular, the transformer-based language models and vision models. And I think they give us an interesting new perspective to try to map out the general properties of intelligence. And now I want to go back to a kind of trite, maybe a little bit tired, but I think newly interesting analogy that many of you have seen to think about this. So if we think about the space of flying things, we have birds at one corner. And before airplanes, we only had birds. And so when we thought about flying, we would think about all the things that are true of birds and try to generalize. Then, of course, at some point, humans invented airplanes. And all of a sudden, we realized that some of the things that are true of birds are not true of flying things in general. And we got a lot more kind of context for extracting principles. So in particular, if we look only at birds, we might see feathers and think that feathers themselves are important. If we look at airplanes, though, there are no feathers in sight, but there are turbine engines. And if we kind of like compare those, we see, oh, some of the things that we might have thought were really important about flying are not actually fundamental to flight. So we can try to start to taxonomize this a little bit, and we can realize that when we analyze the space of flying things, what we might be interested in is universal principles, and those exist. So in the case of flight, it's the principle of the airfoil, or Bernoulli's principle, that is really a kind of central thing across flying all of the things that fly. Then at the bottom, there's things that are really what I'm calling contingent facts, just things that happen to be true of a particular flying system. So for instance, feathers are made from keratin protein strands, and that turns out to be just an accident of evolutionary history. It's not fundamental to flight, even though it might be fundamental to birds. In the middle, we might have things like flapping. Birds flap their wings. And on the one hand, you might think that that's a contingent fact because airplanes don't flap their wings. On the other hand, when you think about the functional demands of birds and realize that unlike airplanes, birds have to take off at a very low speed, flapping certainly makes sense. So you might also call this sort of functional principles instead of universal ones. I put the turbine somewhere in between because it's partly a property of fast takeoff speed, and partly it's something that isn't that's contingent. Okay, but we're not here to talk about birds and flying things. We're here to talk about humans and machines and reasoning. So let me switch. Let me talk about reasoning a little bit. So what's reasoning? Well, basically, reasoning is just how humans seem to answer questions by going through reflective intermediate steps. So if you say, is Socrates mortal? Then you might go through the intermediate steps of saying, well, Socrates is a man and men are mortal. And so, yeah, Socrates is mortal. And that's, you know, the classic case of a syllogism going back to Plato. Or you might do similar things for solving equations in math. So to solve 3x minus 1 equals 2, you go through a series of steps. Each step is quote unquote relatively obvious, but by the end you get to an answer which was maybe not obvious to you. So in thinking about reasoning, I think there's these very deep questions of what are the principles and what are the contingent facts? What should be true of any system that does reasoning versus what's going to be true maybe just for humans or just for language models. So we might ask questions like, what is reasoning? Where does it come from? Are language models able to reason in some way that we think is close enough to call it reasoning? And more broadly, what are the principles versus functional demands versus contingent facts in human and machine reasoning? Okay, so to dive into this, just a couple of years ago, something really, to me, very interesting happened in NLP, which is that people observed that while we had trained these large language models to, as everybody knows, predict the next token, and had usually used them to immediately generate answers to questions, so what's shown as standard prompting here, several authors across a bunch of different papers notice that if you give language models room to generate intermediate reasoning steps and a few examples to show them what kind of steps you're interested in, they all of a sudden get much better answers. So in one paper, this was called chain of thought prompting. And the interesting observation from this paper was that chain of thought prompting yields better accuracy, for instance, at this common sense question answering challenge than just direct answering, although it does so only at fairly large models that have quite a bit of capacity. Another paper that was actually slightly earlier called this scratch pads and showed that for doing multi-digit arithmetic, which was something that language models were really not very good at, if you showed them examples of a kind of systematic arithmetic algorithm, you know, this is sort of like adding up digits one at a time with carry bits and so on, that they could generalize that algorithm and all of a sudden yield substantially better, like radically better results on multi-digit arithmetic. One of the most remarkable things, and again, this was an emergent behavior at some scale of model, one of the most remarkable things here was that without this kind of scratch pad or chain of thought, models would not generalize at all to numbers of digits beyond what they had seen in the examples. With the scratch pad, they started to generalize very well. It was like quite surprising. So I saw this and I basically thought, wow, this really starts to look like what I thought I was interested in when I studied human reasoning. Now, this is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but fairly recently, last month, Felix Hill from DeepMind sort of posted this snarky comment or question on Twitter. Does anybody think neural nets are missing system 2? And I wrote this comment in the middle of the night, and it was just for fun. But then I sort of have reflected on it since, and I think it's interestingly true and interesting to think about. So basically, this chain of thought reasoning, I think it really is something very much like what psychologists, including me, have called system 2. But there are contingent fact differences between what language models do and what humans do. In particular, language models are forced to, quote unquote, move their lips. Language models can't think without generating explicit tokens. That is not true of humans. We can close our mouths and still think step by step on the way to an answer. So I'll come back to this a little bit at the end, but let's follow this down and kind of think, what does this say about reasoning? So in particular, let's go back to the beginning and try to think about the origins of reasoning if we get to use this chain of thought style in language models as a kind of case study or as a way of thinking about it. are there principles that can help us explain the origins of human natural reasoning, as well as the sort of clear, but I think not well explored question of why is it that chain of thought reasoning helps language models? There's no a priori reason that it should. So with my student, Ben Prostowski and Michael Lee, we said, okay, let's strip this down. Let's go back to a very simple kind of case study to think about it. So let's imagine a world that's just a joint distribution over propositional variables defined by a Bayes net. The Bayes net isn't important. It's that it's a joint distribution over a finite set of variables. And let's imagine a brain that is basically just doing a sequential density estimation. So it's just learning to autoregressively predict the next variable that it's going to see given the ones it's seen so far. So it's a sequential density estimator. Now, if you have a sequential density estimator like this, which I'm calling Q, and you want to use it to predict a marginal distribution, the probability of A given C, there's several different statistical estimators that you could use involving Q to predict the marginal P. And I realize there's a typo because this should be a C, sorry. So the first thing you can do is just say, let's directly predict C given A. So we just ask the sequential estimator, okay, here's A, what's C? In the case of a transformer, this really just corresponds to, you put the sequence A equals A, big C equals, and let it fill in little c, figure out what it thinks the value is. Another thing that you can do is let the sequence model sample intermediate variables on its way to C. So maybe you give it A equals A, let it sample B equals B and C equals, and then ask it what value variable C has. So this corresponds to a Monte Carlo estimate where you're randomly sampling intermediate variables and marginalizing them out to get the marginal probability of C given A. Nothing special here. This is just like two very standard, extremely simple estimators for this marginal probability. What's interesting though, is that the second estimator, the Monte Carlo one, looks exactly what chain of thought is doing for large language models, right? You give it a question, you allow it to freely generate intermediate steps, and then you ask it for the answer. And so we can look at the value of reasoning in this setup by looking at the gap between the direct estimator and the Monte Carlo or intermediate variable estimator. So if one of them, if the direct estimator has much more bias than the indirect estimator, then we'll say, hey, reasoning is worthwhile in this setup, in this domain. If they give you equal quality estimates, then the reasoning is not going to be valuable. Just to kind of go into a tiny bit more detail about the training setup here, it looks kind of like this. So we start with a big Bayes net. We generate training samples by first sampling from the Bayes net. And then critically, we select an observation region of the Bayes net. I'll say more about that in a second. We take the variables in that observation region. We randomly order them with the target variable, the query variable at the end. And that's a training example. And then we just train a standard GPT-style transformer on that data. Now, what we're manipulating is both how we use that transformer to predict the marginal probabilities, whether it's the direct or the reasoning, the indirect estimator. And critically, we also manipulate the structure of these observation regions. So you could either just observe the entire Bayes net at once. That's the global observation condition. You could observe a subset of the variables, but drawn randomly across the Bayes net, or you could observe a local region. So we choose a variable and we extend out several steps along the graph structure from that variable. So that's this local observation condition. Now, the reason we did that is because if you think about human learning, we have an egocentric viewpoint. So when we see the world, we see the things nearby and in front of us, and that structures the data that we're learning from. Okay. So then here's the basic results of this experiment. So again, we either evaluate using the direct prediction estimator or the free generation estimator. So solid line is direct and dashed line is free generation, aka the chain of thought. And we do it with either training conditions where the Bayes net is fully observed, that's blue, or where it's locally observed, that's red. Now, the most important takeaway here is that if you don't have locally structured data, there's no value to reasoning. It's not useful to do this sort of intermediate local reasoning. If you do have locally structured data, then reasoning becomes valuable, basically because you understand the local structure of the world, but you need to stitch together this sort of local understanding in order to get longer range estimates. The other thing that's kind of remarkable about this plot is that there's a huge data complexity impact. If you ask your transformer to focus on only learning the local structure of the world, it learns that local structure much faster than if you give it the task of learning sort of everything globally about the world. In some sense, that's not surprising, but I also think it's a really important observation about the right way to train sequential density estimators and cognition in general. Okay, so what are the takeaways from this little project? Well, the first is, as I said, if training data is organized into local observations, but not global or random or some other baselines, then reasoning through intermediate variables, chain of thought, is helpful. Now, in the paper, we actually prove a theorem about this in a simplified case. I won't go into the details, but you can show that essentially for some simple BaseNet structures, the risk minimizing estimator has this reasoning gap property. And the reason that I wanted to mention this, that it's important, is that this really doesn't have to do with transformers per se. This has to do with sequential density estimators that are risk minimizers. Transformers just happen to be a really good way of doing that, but they're not at all a unique way of doing that. Okay, as I mentioned, the data complexity is also much lower. And so the takeaway is that reasoning using chain of thought as kind of the I don't know, the stand-in for what I'm going to call reasoning for this purpose, is something that emerges for sequence models under certain conditions about the training data. It's not about the model architecture per se, it's this locally structured property of the training data. Okay, so you might have noticed that in that previous section, when the model was asked to do reasoning, it would just randomly generate intermediate variables however it wanted. And that's enough to get a benefit to reasoning. However, that's not actually kind of what human reasoning looks like for people like us who have spent years and years being educated. Somehow we've managed to make our reasoning better over time and practice. So you might ask, can we make large language models improve from practice or from minimal amounts of feedback? So my student Eric Seligman and co-authors made a system called the self-taught reasoner, and it's actually a super simple kind of probably the most possible simple reinforcement learning algorithm. What it does is it simply says, okay, let's take a large language model that's doing chain of thought reasoning, and let's give it new problems. Let's let it generate its own rationale, its own reasoning, generate an answer, and then we'll check. We'll say, yes, that was right or incorrect or not. And the simplest version, if it got the right answer, we'll add that to the training data set for fine tuning. So we're going to fine tune it on its own correct reasoning traces. And this, actually shockingly to me, I didn't think this was going to work. This works really well. So this is the case of multi-digit arithmetic that I mentioned earlier. And what you see here is iterations is the number of iterations of this, this star self-taught reasoner process. So 0 is the initial model. And then what you see is that after the first iteration or two, the model figures out how to do one-digit arithmetic problems, but it's still quite bad at others. And then it gradually extends that in Bootstrap, sort of figuring out how to do 2, 3, 4, 5-digit arithmetic problems. We can also do this for the common sense QA data set, which is these kind of short, I don't love this data set, but it's kind of like these short common sense-ish questions that had been used previously for chain of thought. And the baselines here, so we're fine-tuning the GPT-J model. By the way, if we did this today, we would fine tune whatever came out, 30 seconds ago, Llama or Vicuna or something. But GPT-J was the biggest model we could train when we did this a year and a half ago. And so the baseline is, if you just use few-shot chain of thought prompting with GPTJ, you get about 36%. If you use GPTJ fine-tuned on the final answers without chain of thought on the whole data set, you get about 60%. If you take GPT-3 and fine-tune it on the whole data set, you get 73%. And the self-taught reasoner, the basic version, gets up to about 67 or 68, 69%. Okay, so then Eric thought, yeah, but when people get an answer wrong, they still learn something from the fact that they got the answer wrong. So he wanted to see if we could get that. And so he added this extra thing, which says, okay, if the model tries to solve a problem and gets it wrong, then why don't we give it a hint? We're going to go back and we're going to annotate the correct answer with, well, correct. And then we're going to ask it to generate a rationale, a reasoning trace, and an answer. And then we'll check again and see if it got it right. Now, the model actually doesn't always get the answer right, even when you give it the answer. So that's interesting. But it does quite a bit more often. And so then what we can do is take the rationale it gave, strip out the extra hint, and treat that as a training example and put it back into the training set. So he calls this the rationalization pathway. And when you do that, you get a little boost in performance, a little bit important, I should say. And now all of a sudden, STAR with rationalization matches the performance of GPT-3 when it's directly fine-tuned on the data. Okay, so cool. So it turns out that, yeah, actually language models, benefit from reasoning, as other people had shown, and they also benefit from learning how to reason by kind of, studying, so to speak. Here's a little interlude. So there's a lot known about human reasoning. One of the most important effects in human reasoning for the kind of basic logical reasoning is that people are not good formal reasoners, because for us, there's a lot of interference from our common sense knowledge. So one of the basic effects here, which is sometimes called a content effect or a belief bias, is that in common sense situations, we are much more likely to endorse conclusions that are consistent with common sense than those that are inconsistent, even if they're both logically valid. So for instance, all students read, some people who read also write essays, therefore some students write essays. People are going to say, yeah, that's great. An equivalent, formally equivalent argument, all students read, some people who read are professors, therefore some students are professors. People are going to say, oh, no, that's no good, right? And this is a belief bias. It's based on our common sense belief. This goes back actually, the particular study is from papers by Evans, but it goes back substantially before then. So there was a really nice paper just in the last 6 months or something like that, not very long ago, from some folks from DeepMind, mostly former Stanford people, where they basically just said, okay, let's do these experiments with large language models. And so they set up belief consistent, belief inconsistent, syllogistic reasoning, as well as novel or nonsense syllogistic reasoning, so with no content effects. And the basic observation replicated the human findings, namely that in cases where the conclusion is consistent with a priori beliefs, the model tends to just say, yes, this is a valid syllogism. And in cases where it violates our belief, the model mostly says no, but actually it's a little bit more subtle to the logical validity in that case, which is also what people do. Okay, so something that we've done very recently, and it's going to take me just a few extra slides to build this up, so bear with me, is we've said, well, people have found ways to work around our own biases. In particular, well, naive humans who you get to do experiments are very subject to belief bias. I'll bet if I asked all of you in this room to do those syllogistic reasoning cases, you would catch yourself and you'd think carefully step by step, so to speak, and you'd come to the formal conclusion that first order logic wants you to come to. So what humans are able to do is externalize our reasoning using these tools that we've come up with. So for instance, by using logic in order to avoid certain things that we've determined are reasoning fallacies. So recently, my student Gabriel Poesia and co-authors started asking whether language models could also benefit from this kind of externalized reasoning. So the first thing that we did, actually, this is a little ahistorical. We did this first, and I'll come back to it, is we defined a theorem proving language and environment. He calls this piano. And it's basically a dependently typed lambda calculus, very, very similar to Lean and Cook, if you know those. So I won't go into the details because it's not that important, but what is important is that it's expressive enough to express formalizations for all the standard proof theories that you would want in math. The other important thing about piano is that we restrict the proof rules, and we restrict the proof rules in such a way that you can only apply a single axiom for each proof rule, which effectively limits the action space at every proof step to be a finite space. It doesn't actually limit the expressivity of the language. You can get to the same proofs eventually, but you'll have to take more steps. And the reason that we do this is that the kind of techniques that we like to use in language models and reinforcement learning more generally work a lot better if the action space is finite at every step. And so it's very, very hard actually to do modern machine learning with a language like Cook or Lean because of this sort of explosion of possible next steps that could be derived. So piano is very similar, but it limits it to a finite action space. Okay. I don't have much to say here other than you can formalize all the standard things that you want in piano. So here's sort of algebra and geometry and number theory and all this good stuff. So then the idea was, okay, let's use this formal reasoning tool to augment a language model. And this is a kind of high-level schematic. It's pretty hard to look at, that I'll explain in just a second. But the basic idea here is that language models are responsible for generating sequences token by token. That's great. That's what they do well. Proof systems are responsible for generating derivable next steps given the terms that you've derived so far. They do that really well, and that's great. We want to put these two things together. And the way that we're going to put these two things together is by having these constrained generation blocks where we don't let the language model generate just anything it wants. We restrict the language model to generate something which is valid according to the logical inference engine. And we're sort of seeing schematically here that while we still generate that sequence step by step, token by token, we do it in a way where we disallow sequences which are not going to be considered valid by the logical engine. Now there's a little bit of, let me go here and say this. There's a little bit of subtlety to how we do this. So the basic high-level sketch is actually very simple. The language model is allowed to generate a special type of open bracket. When it does generate that open bracket, it goes into constrained generation mode where it can only generate things that are true according to the proof system. The way we actually do the constraint is a very clever algorithm called synchromesh that lets you restrict to the closure of a regular expression when you're doing generation. I'm not going to explain it, but there's a nice paper on it. And then when the language model generates the close bracket, it goes back to freely generating. It turns out that this is a very general thing that you can do in language models that we call a guide tool. It generalizes the kind of tool use that people have been doing with language models a lot recently. And in particular, if the underlying computation you use to constrain inside the constrained blocks is logic, so like piano, we get something we call the logic guide. And now the logic guide basically can do two kinds of things. It can either decide to introduce a new object, relation, or axiom, or it can decide to do an inference step, which is constrained to be reachable in one axiomatic step from the terms constructed previously. Let me show you an example. So what we give to the language model, first of all, we give a few shot, I think just one few shot demonstration so that it knows what it looks like to use the logic tool. Otherwise, it won't ever generate the opening brackets. Then we give it the problem. So for instance, we tell it the story, the mouse visits the tiger. If something visits the tiger, it visits the mouse, and so on. And then the language model is going to generate this block where the orange things here are objects, relations, and axioms that it's formalizing. So it goes through this process of formalizing the natural language that you give it. And it's actually quite good at doing this formalization from just one shot, one example. It formalizes the goal, and then the blue parts here are where it decides to use the inference step and does constrained generation of kind of logically reachable states. Okay, so now what we want to compare is how well does a language model that's given this extra logic guide sort of externalization do compared to the language model that isn't given the external tool. So first of all, if we go back and we look at the syllogism task from that Dasgupta paper, well, really from the Evans psychological research. So what I'm showing you, the blue bars are what happens with the language models. This is 3 different language models just by themselves doing chain of thought reasoning. And indeed, what we see is that they're not great at this, right? There's this strong belief bias effect. It's actually interesting how it comes out here. In the consistent case, the language model basically always gives the answer which is consistent with prior knowledge, which means because the data set is balanced, that it's correct 50% of the time, it's at chance. In the inconsistent case, it's a little bit more accurate because it actually reasons according to logical validity slightly more often when the conclusion violates the common sense knowledge, which is also what people do. Okay, and then the orange bars are showing what happens when you let the language model use the logic guide. And you can see that we're basically at ceiling for the stronger models, GPT-3 and GPT 3.5. So even though we only give it one example of using this externalization, it's really quite good at using it and then paying attention to it when it generates an answer in order to get correct answers. Now, the llama model is smaller and, well, weaker. And it's interesting that, first of all, it's completely at chance without logic guide. There's a little bit of a boost with logic guide, but it's nothing like at ceiling. And I'm going to come back to this in a minute. We can also then look at multi-step reasoning. So the example I showed here, the silly kind of example with the mice and the tigers, this is drawn from a multi-step reasoning task called Pronto QA. And so we can look at the Pronto QA in a similar data set called Proofwriter. And this is again broken down into the kind of belief consistent, belief inconsistent, and nonsense word splits of the data set. And the plots I'm showing you here are the, I guess, lightweight sort of, hard to see lines are without logic guide, and the heavier lines are with logic guide, and the colors are the different models. And so what you see is that, not surprisingly, Pronto QA in the true condition is sort of close to ceiling for everybody. That's because if you are consistent with common sense knowledge, then you get the right answer in the true condition. In the false condition, though, the models that don't have logic guide are really quite bad, particularly as the number of logical reasoning hops required gets longer. And logic guide largely fixes that and allows the model to reason, much more correctly, even with, well, I was going to say quite long. It's not that long, 3 or 4 reasoning steps. The notable exception here is the llama model. Again, the llama model is just not very good at this kind of reasoning to start with. And while logic guide makes it a little bit better in many of the cases, it's nowhere near at ceiling. So it's sort of not able to properly pay attention to the extra information. So we decided to go and say, well, what happens if we do that self-taught reasoner STAR process now with the logic guide as part of the process? And now there's a really interesting failure mode of STAR. So this is a task with a binary response. And the problem with binary responses is that if you choose at random, you'll be right half the time. And if you then train yourself on your own reasoning when you are right half the time by accident, you'll reinforce incorrect patterns of reasoning. And so what you see in the red curve here is if we just do naive STAR, it kind of improves a tiny bit at the beginning, and then it starts to catastrophically interfere with itself. Okay, so then we can say what happens if we use the guide, which makes responses better, and just that's all we do. And the result is like, we get an initial improvement just because you have the guide and it provides a little bit of better accuracy. But then there's still a fair number of responses that are kind of correct for the wrong reasons. And so the performance starts to degrade as you keep training on your own reasoning. So the last thing we tried, which is the yellow curve, is to only train on arguments where logic guide derived a valid conclusion. Now, this doesn't guarantee that the reasoning is correct, because the logic guide could have formalized the problem incorrectly. It only guarantees that given how it formalized the problem, it has derived a valid conclusion from that formalization. But that turns out to be enough. That winnows out a lot of the bad reasoning, and then this is the yellow curve. You can see that now it's starting to bootstrap. And so to me, this is really interesting because it means there's this synergy between self-study and having these formalized, externalized cognition systems. They go really nicely together. Okay, cool. Now, those of you who think a lot about reasoning, especially logical reasoning, which I know is a bunch of people in the room, might have the criticism that the reasoning that you have to do is not very extensive in these cases, right? Okay, 5 steps of logical reasoning, okay, it's pretty big because of the branching factor, but it's not gigantic. So another thing that we've been thinking about is, what does this look like in domains that are kind of, in some sense, more, I don't know if I want to say realistic, but like more useful and closer to things that people actually are forced to learn. And in particular, we've been looking at middle school math and high school math kinds of cases. So Khan Academy is this amazing resource. It's a curriculum for math from basically first grade through high school. And we did a case study where we went into the Khan Academy algebra curriculum, and we just extracted the first 5 sections of Khan Academy algebra. And these are things like learning to substitute and evaluate expressions, combining like terms, 1-step addition and subtraction equations, 1-step multiplication equations, and then what they call 2-step equations. So they're all, at the end of the day, learning to solve what are very simple equations. But the thing that's important about even these simple equations is that the solutions, if you derive them from the axioms of algebra, are really like quite long. So let me, first of all, we can formalize this in piano. So piano, like any other theorem proving language, is a nice place to formalize this. And the formalization is not long. You have, some real types, some commutativity, associativity, et cetera, axioms. And then what we do is we write the axioms in piano. Importantly, that's not important. We turn the exercises that we find from Khan Academy into templates for sampling new problems, so that we have a pretty big distribution of problems from each of those sections of Khan Academy. Okay, now this specifies a well-defined search problem, right? Here's just standard logical search problem. It's well-defined, but the branching factor at every step is kind of huge. And it takes actually a lot of axiomatic steps to get an answer, even for simple equations. And so it turns out that if you do combinatorial search naively, it doesn't work very well. Now I'm basically saying what everybody knew in the 1950s or 60s. But if we just, in this case, do breadth first search up to some pretty large amount, we solve really a pretty low percentage of each section of Khan Academy. So we have to do something a little bit smarter. Now, the thing that we tried, first, let me stop and say, of course, there's a lot of smarter things that people know how to do. You can use A*, admissible heuristics, and all of these kinds of things. What we were interested in is what it looks like if you ask a reinforcement learning agent to learn how to do search itself, rather than sort of teaching it, showing it how to do search a priori. And so what we did in a series of papers was we basically used the same extremely simple reinforcement learning algorithm that I showed you for STAR, which is sometimes called expert iteration, that just iterates back and forth between using your existing search policy to you randomly sample problems, try to solve them using some simple beam search with an existing policy, and then you throw out the ones that you don't find an answer, and then you imitate, you do fine tuning on the ones where you get a successful answer, and then you iterate, you keep doing this. So it's the same loop that I showed you before. So in this case, we weren't using a language model. This was way back in 2021, which is like ancient history now. We were instead doing what's called contrastive learning. Here I have a picture of this over here. So contrastive learning, basically, you're learning a representation for equations for states by embedding the strings into some vector space. And contrastive learning just says that you're going to try to bring two states that are on a valid solution path closer together and send states that are on invalid solution paths farther apart. You do it with a little bit of a fancy estimator that reduces noise. And it turns out that's enough to then learn a representation space where your policy is just move to the possible next state that's closest to your current state. That works pretty well, it turns out. And so when we do that, what we find in these Khan Academy domains is that the first several sections are solved well, but it gets stuck after that. It's not making a lot of progress. And so Gabriel dug into this. He said, okay, why is it getting stuck? And he observed that, not surprisingly, as we move from section to section, the solutions are getting longer in terms of the initial axioms. And this is particularly a compounding problem when you're doing the kind of term rewriting inference like piano, because the more steps you've taken, the more terms you've constructed, and the more possible next terms there are to evaluate. So there's this like huge branching factor explosion. And so the probability of actually just finding valid solutions to bootstrap from kind of falls precipitously. It's really the complementary problem to the one that I talked about before with STAR. The earlier problem was it was too easy to find answers that were right for the wrong reasons. And this problem is that it's just too hard to find any answer at all when you restrict it to the right reasons. So Gabriel thought a little bit about kind of intuitively what's going on with humans when they're learning these things. And the important observation is that by the time you get to a problem from what they call one-step addition and subtraction equations, you're not thinking in terms of the most basic units of the most basic axioms anymore. You've already learned about substituting and evaluating and combining like terms. And so in terms of those sort of earlier sections of Khan Academy, you can really just think about the solution as 3 steps. You can think of it as like, oh, I observe that I can subtract a number from both sides. That's kind of the new step here. Then I combine like terms and I substitute in on the right-hand side, and then that solves it. So in terms of these kind of alternative units of reasoning, what would have been I think it's like, 15-step solution becomes a 3-step solution. And so Gabriel's idea was this is probably what human students are doing as they go through the curriculum. They're learning these abstractions that they can use to reorganize and simplify the proofs. So can we do something similar? So we kind of reached back into this nice old literature on program induction. And in that literature, so first we introduced tactics to piano, and tactics are really just sequences of axioms or other tactics. And then we do tactic induction by anti-unification. So what this means is we just look at all of our successful solutions so far, we line them up and we look for parts that match, and we try to create new functions based on the things that match, introducing variables for the parts that don't match. So like P0 here doesn't match between the 2 green things. Okay, and so this gives us a kind of interestingly augmented version of that expert iteration loop, where first we again solve a bunch of random problems, but now using our current tactics as axiomatic steps. Then we try to do anti-unification to compress the solutions and find some new good tactics. And then we rewrite using the new tactics and train the model, train the policy to solve based on those. So we introduce this additional abstraction step in the middle. Oh, and I should have said this here. This is sort of similar to Kevin Ellis's work on Dreamcoder, which is a very cool system, but this is all done in a theorem proving sort of setup, which changes a few of the important details. Okay, and it turns out that now if you do this abstraction step, you can solve all of the sections of Khan Academy. And it's interesting that it undergoes these kind of transition moments where if you dig into that, what you find is happening is that it gets enough evidence to form a useful abstraction, a new tactic, and that's what lets it then find the solutions it needs to train on. Okay, almost done. So the one additional thing we found about this, which I think is cool. So here's a fact about human math that has puzzled me since my graduate student days. So it took a long time historically to invent things like algebra. And yet we expect high school students to learn all of algebra very quickly in one or two semesters. And there's lots of ideas about what accounts for that acceleration. Why is it that a single human can recapitulate what took human society so long to get to? But one of the ideas is that it's the curriculum, the order that we introduce things, that matters. So we realized that we could actually do a kind of simple test of this idea using this piano with tactics. Basically, initially training problems were not seen in any curriculum order. We just took random problems. But solutions that have tactics can be ordered because tactics call other tactics. And so you can just do a topo sort based on which solutions rely on tactics that depend on each other. And you can make a curriculum just according to that topological ordering. So the problems that require simple tactics go first, and et cetera. And so the green curve here is if you go back and you train a fresh copy of the agent using that curriculum order based on the tactics from the blue curve. And what we found was that systematically, the curriculum ordered agent learns the same thing faster. So, putting the things in the order that supports the correct tactics indeed speeds up learning. Not enough, I think, to account for like 300 years compressed to one semester, but enough to be, I think, pretty interesting. Oh, it also reconstructs the curriculum of the original Khan Academy curriculum pretty well, up to symmetries in the ordering. Okay, let me finish off. So I started off with this picture where I said, hey, all of a sudden we have two intelligences in the space of intelligent things. What can we figure out from kind of comparing and contrasting them? And then I kind of like went off onto a wild digression about birds and airplanes and stuff. But the basic point here is that once we can compare things, we can ask, okay, what looks like a universal principle? What looks like a functional demand or a functional principle? And what looks like accidental facts? Now, this is not intended to be anything like the final answer, but I do think that by studying language models and comparing to human reasoning, you can start to extract these really interesting things. Like I tried to argue at the beginning that sequence prediction, not necessarily transformer architectures, but sequence prediction and these properties of the training data, like local observations, I think are universal principles that explain when and why reasoning is helpful. On the other hand, I think some of the stuff that I talked about in the middle, things like self-improvement and externalization, I don't think those are universal. I think you can have reasoning systems that don't interface with those, but I do think they look very much like functional demands or functional principles, right? If you want a system that's going to self-improve, it's going to need to have certain properties like the ability to sort out good reasoning from bad reasoning. Finally, I think there's things that really are contingent facts. So, some people look at language models generating step-by-step reasoning and say, haha, look at the language models, moving their lips. They have to talk when they reason. People don't do that. And I think that's true, but I think it's a boring consequence of just how we happen to build those language models. Similarly, we humans have incredibly bad working memory. And I think a lot of the things that we have to do and the things that we have to externalize are probably a consequence of that evolutionary accident. And hopefully this kind of taxonomy is something that will now that we have more examples of useful agents, and not just the ones that I talked about here, we can sort of learn more about the space of intelligence and not be overly optimizing on human intelligence. Well, there should be one more slide that thanks my students, but it is not changing. So hopefully it'll go. Anyhow, thanks to my students who did all of this work.
Fantastic. That was absolutely riveting. And we've got questions in the room.
Yes, thank you. This was fascinating. You made the jump from intelligence to reasoning. Now, and you kind of assume that large language models are therefore intelligent, but are there not other important aspects of intelligence other than reasoning?
Yeah, I don't know. You know, I teach the introduction to science at Stanford, and the thing that I'm most annoyed about with the whole community that really is clear in Intro to CogSci is that we sort of assume that we know what intelligence is by intuition or by love. That doesn't smell intelligent, and that does. So I guess these days, my instinct is to say, look, if it does a whole lot of behaviors that we previously had considered intelligent human behavior, then let's put it in that class of intelligent systems and try to understand it and understand like the differences, rather than thinking that we know where the boundaries need to be. And so I guess my answer is like, I'm interested in reasoning just a priori. That's what I'm, particularly interested in. And I don't know where the boundary should be between intelligent and unintelligent. And so taking these things as examples and seeing what they do and how they compare to human reasoning seems like a productive way forward. That's fair. Yeah. I mean, maybe you would want to say like, intelligent reasoning, and then, certainly intelligent perception is somewhere else entirely. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for an interesting talk. I don't know if this is pedantic or a substantive critique, but no one reasons in any professional capacity in anything like the fashion that piano does. Humans reason when they do it deductively using natural deduction, right? So it's all hypothetical driven. And in the teaching of logic in the Western world, this is not, you don't learn formal logic in keeping with any Hilbert style stuff. You learn, again, natural deduction. Mm-hmm. Okay. So this is, from that standpoint, bizarre. When you give these large language models any of the hypothetical driven reasoning that you would traditionally teach even in a first decent course in formal logic, and they can't fall back on, it relates to what you said about the search space, a single inference schemata or one or two. That's meaningless. It's not what humans do. Okay, that's not what reasoners do when they are doing serious reasoning. So I guess this might be a stepping stone on the way to that, but I don't get it. Now, again, maybe pedantic. The second thing is you have to immediately teach second order logic. Okay, without second order logic, you can't reason about arbitrary properties, and we teach that. And if we don't have second order logic, we're in trouble. So a good place to look historically for where this paid great dividends would be Einstein's gift received from Gödel. How did he prove time travel is possible? Did he derive it from axioms? No. He imagined a hypothetical situation and then proceeded to reason from that. And it's also second, if not third order. Now you might say, well, we don't want, this is, early stuff, but I'll let you,
respond.
Absolutely. Sorry. Yeah. But you know what I'm saying.
Yeah. So, okay. On the one hand, mostly missing the point. On the other hand, there's an element here that I agree with. So actually, first, let me just clarify. Piano is dependently typed lambda calculus, so it's higher order. I used it in a first order setting, but that's actually not a constraint. I think the question of what is the basis, the axiomatic basis to use, is interesting and important. There are very good reasons that the formal methods community is using, things like Koch and Lean that are based on dependently typed lambda calculus. It's actually really hard to ground out most of the math that we care about for professional mathematicians into natural deduction, partly because of the higher order issue, actually. So like, I don't have a big horse in this race, but I think like there's formal reasons to tie into that. The critical thing here is not any of that. The critical thing is really understanding how the relationship basically between, you know, a search space, a formally specified search space that is capable of solving in principle the problems that you're giving it, and the kind of the structure of intermediate reasoning and learning to reason, right? We've actually also done this for natural deduction, and the same things happen. It's just that actually for most audiences, natural deduction seems kind of unusual, and so it's harder to explain. There's one technical thing that is super important that I want to endorse, which is Piano at the moment doesn't support backward reasoning steps. That is important, and interestingly, like there's a very critical moment in a mathematics curriculum where that happens, which is not algebra, it's not up through high school. It's the first advanced math courses that all of a sudden you need to do backward reasoning. And this is something we're kind of thinking about now. It's related also to like, how do you introduce proof by induction, right? Sorry, one kind of irrelevant thing I wanted to mention, trying to limit the number of proof rules, I think is like not actually a good idea, because when you go down that route, you get to resolution. And there's this amazing quote in the paper on resolution, which is that this is a completely human indecipherable, you know, it's one rule, but it's completely human indecipherable by construction. So it's not clear that that's the ultimate route. I'd be happy to chat more about this afterward, though.
We've got four more questions in the room.
I'll try to be fast, sorry.
Well, no, because it's fantastically interesting. You've come such a long way. So.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. So I really love this work. It's fascinating. I mean, I don't think, you know, these LLMs are AGIs or are going to be transformable into AGIs, nor that they're necessarily thinking a lot like humans are, but I think they're extraordinarily interesting systems, and I'm quite curious to probe what they can do and they can't do. And so along those lines, so I mean, I've been playing with these systems myself, like probably all of us. So with the simple arithmetic stuff from Khan Academy, it's impressive and interesting, but obviously there's very many examples of that precise sort of math in the training data set on the web, which is helpful. Now, of course, humans are largely doing things of which we've seen many examples in our life history also. So that's, but not as many examples, right? So what one would like to see, and it's a bit ill-defined, like if one had a comparable class of problems of sort of, in some sense, vaguely comparable complexity and difficulty, like not general relativity field equations, but some other formal system, like some alien might have made up, which didn't have 10 fingers or something, right? Some comparably simple body of math knowledge, and tried to get the algorithm to do that, then it would be interesting to see what sort of transfer could be done, or how much worse it did without all that priming with so many arithmetic problems online. And I've tried similar-ish things with ethical reasoning, was actually impressed with how GPT-4 did. Like you give ethics puzzles from human situations, or you then define an alien civilization and give ethics puzzles in the context of the alien civilization. It doesn't do badly in that context, but these ethics puzzles are in a way even shallower in terms of inference depth than arithmetic. So I mean, I that's hard and annoying to set up, obviously. So I see why you haven't done it, but I'm sort of wondering, what's your even intuition about how these systems might do in that sort of setting?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the data complexity question is, so people bring this is only a small part of what you said, but people bring this up a lot, but I think it's actually like devilishly hard to get straight. Just like there's so many dimensions that differ in the experience of, you know, most of our language models versus, say, a high school, you know, student, human high school student. The kind of data that they see, right? Human students get a lot of kind of natural language explanation as well as the other stuff, et cetera, et cetera. So like this is part of the reason that I think, like, you know, conceptualizing it as this like space of agents that have different experience and we can explore their different capacities is maybe more useful. They generalize pretty well, actually. They're not, how to say it, like, you could hold them to a really high standard, which is like, I made up a crazy new, formal domain, gave them 6 examples, and I expect them to learn and generalize perfectly. They don't do that, but neither do humans, right? So we've done, this is preliminary and not published, but we've done some simple things where we create these string rewrite domains, right? So basically there are string rewrite rules that define novel domains, which have at a high level similar structure to the way, like algebra works, right? You go with a string, you have some axioms that allow you to rewrite. By defining novel domains, we can come up with systems that humans have never seen before, and similarly models. And then we can get a little bit more of an apples to apples comparison. And like, the finding so far is that these are really hard for humans. Like, humans are not good at this. They benefit a lot from a curriculum, but not perfectly. And that our models kind of are similarly not amazing. They benefit from a curriculum. I think they're a little bit better than humans at these things. But a lot depends on the prior knowledge and kind of the training. So I guess, to the very first part of your question, my take here is that, like, these things don't have to be human-like intelligence in order to be intelligent, and that makes it more exciting because now we can compare and contrast. I think they're intelligent because look at all the things they can do that we didn't think they'd be able to do, like when I was last at AGI 10 years ago or something, right? And I think they're general just by virtue of the fact that they do a lot of different things. Now, it turns out probably when we said AGI 15, 20 years ago, there were some other things we had in mind that like aren't in the name, right? And that's a great coffee conversation. Right. Yeah, okay, that's fair. And I think they generalize surprisingly well, but it's like individual humans who are not us don't actually generalize all that well, right? And so I think that's the starting point you have to go from. And then you say, okay, do these generalize, as well, same, different? Yeah. I don't want to take up too much more time, but
we've lots of questions coming through. No questions online, but I hope you're following all of the great discussion. We've got a common question from our conference chair, Klaas.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Noah, for a great talk. So I'm curious about search, where search comes in. And do you think that search maybe should be added to those universal principles of reasoning that you mentioned? And I also wonder if you think that search needs to be added to get large language models to be able to do system 2 reasoning.
Yeah, okay, awesome question. So look, there's 2 ways to add search in these language model settings. One is basically searches in a computation outside the language model that structures what the language model, how the language model searches over continuations. And the other is inside the language model, where basically the language model decides what steps to take, including backtracking and going on from somewhere else. Both things have been tried recently. So there's a paper called Tree of Thought that does the first one. There's a couple of papers that partially do the second one. It's not clear which of those is going to be most productive, but I think it philosophically matters a lot, because if it turns out that the language model can learn how to do search internally inside its own sequence modeling, then I think search is not sort of a top level principle. It's something that emerges from learning to do reasoning. I would love to see that happen, but I think we don't know yet. On the other hand, it is possible that like it won't spontaneously emerge, that you have to build in something about the structure. One thing that we do know from a recent paper, or the field knows, and I know from a recent paper of one of my students, is that if you show large language models examples of systematically searching over, we were doing game trees for like matrix games, right? Simple game theory. It's actually reasonably good at generalizing to other matrix games and sort of recapitulating that search process. And so that makes me think that it may in fact be sequence modeling that's the basic thing, and that search arises out of that, but we'll see. There was one, yeah.
Thank you for your fascinating job. I really think that language models is one of the missed components for the AGI, and we need to understand how to continuously learn distribution drift. But my question about the guided fine-tuning, do you think that it's possible to completely end-to-end train a language model based on the Turing complete symbolic program? And maybe this is one of the solutions for alignment problem. Thank you.
Okay, yeah. By the way,
Thank you.
online lifelong learning, I agree. We don't know how to do it very well. We should figure it out. Low rank approximations are a good trick, though. They're really cool. Okay, so with respect to the computational issue, the Turing completeness, here's two, I think, fascinating facts. One, transformers are not Turing complete. They have actually a pretty restricted space of formal expressivity. So for instance, they can't solve the parity problem with some star. There's some assumptions there that they can't solve parity. Language models with chain of thought reasoning are computationally more expressive than language models without intermediate reasoning. That's interesting. Language models with even the simplest kind of external guide, like the logic guide that I showed, actually now are universally complete. So it actually and it's very similar to the way that if you take two context-free grammars and intersect them, all of a sudden you're not context-free anymore. And so I think there's actually, even though transformers are not complete, there's kind of a bunch of fairly simple things you can do to boost them up to that point. And so I think that means that it might not be as hard as it might have looked although there's still huge training questions of how you mix those things together. Yeah. That's a complicated question. So it's not end-to-end because there's discrete things. So most of the models I was showing you was basically doing training as a reinforcement learning setup, although in this really simple expert iteration style, right? So that's not end-to-end because you can't get gradients through the token generation. It's not totally clear that you need to be because these kind of simple RL approaches work well. And similarly, RLHF is not end-to-end, right? And yet it works well. So whether that is still clearly for pre-training for scalability reasons, you need that. I actually think that what we actually have discovered is that all we care about is risk minimizing sequential density estimators, and that the magic, which is not very magical, has just been in how do we do that at scale, right? We've gotten a lot better at that. End-to-end was helpful, but may not be required, et cetera.
Oh, yes. Thank you for a lovely talk. I really enjoyed that. You'll have to pardon me if my question is naive. I'm a poor, stupid mathematician. So
Me too.
All this AI stuff is way over my head. But I was quite interested by the justification branch of the star reasoner. And in particular, when I inspect my own mathematical experience, what I find is both a wild ass proposer and then someone who's quite skeptical on the other side, and there's a game going back and forth, very similar to the sorts of things we see in Lakatos's account of proofs. Yeah. And I wonder if you've explored this, where you combine both proposer and opponent.
Yeah, I haven't, but there is recent research that does this, and I guess let me just mention two things. There's one paper from, I guess, last year, its name I'm forgetting, but basically it looks at verifiers and shows that if you do something a lot like STAR, where you don't know the right answer, but you generate many examples. And one thing you can do is have them vote, but another thing you can have them do is you can have an external verifier to say which of these looks good. That helps a lot. And that's really cool. The other thing that is very recent and that I find fascinating is that people have been doing a lot more natural language critique as part of this revision. So we didn't do any, it was just correct or incorrect. Recently, people have been asking, this only works for GPT-4. It seems to be, yet another emergent thing, but they've been asking the models to generate natural language critiques of their own failures and using that to revise. And that seems to be pretty effective, which I find again, similar to my personal, introspection and really fascinating. And there's a nice paper called Reflexion that does that, as well as several others in the last, 2 days. I mean, it's actually a month, but yeah.
Well, I feel like this conversation could just go on and on in the room. Thank you all very much for your questions. Thank you, Noah, for a really stimulating start to the day today. Thank you for coming all the way here. Let's have a big round of applause for Noah Goodman. Thank you.